Who in the room feels that AI is improving your daily lives? Show of hands. Think about it. You shouldn't have to think too hard about it. Improving? Yeah. I feel like it's improving my life. I mean, it's kind of in every aspect of my life. You know, there's the obvious things like ChatGPT and Midjourney. I use that all the time. But it's kind of crept into all of the other apps that I've used for years and years and years. And, you know, it's there in my email, it's there in my banking, it's just everywhere. It's inescapable. Second question, who thinks that AI has the potential to harm them? Oh, about the same number. Okay, so we're on the same page here, I think, because what we're going to be talking about today is some simple things that you can do when you're considering using AI to power the digital products and services that you're building. So what we're going to be working through is some principles and some simple questions that you can ask of your team before you consider powering your digital products with AI or Gen AI. So to begin with, why AI?
So we're living in a time of like rapid AI adoption. As Kate mentioned, it's like in every aspect of our lives and products we use. And we do see it deliver some great outcomes for businesses and consumers. So actually one such example I want to highlight was actually built by Thoughtworks in partnership with Linton AI. So it's the U Rewards Club. I'm pretty sure if you're in Singapore, you go to Cold Storage, you use it all the time. And what sets it apart is that there is hyper-personalized experiences. And what that means is that because of the AI platform, it enables the brand partners that you engage with, for the brand partners to directly engage the customers on this single platform to personalize the offers and rewards that they can issue to individual consumers. So that's an aspect that is kind of a win-win for both business and consumers. And obviously for our own personal benefit, like everyone has voice assistant on their smartphones already. So why not, right?
But alongside this rapid adoption of AI in our lives, we're increasingly seeing the risks play out in terms of, you know, every day we're reading newspaper headlines of what's going wrong with AI. And often the story is about the disruptors versus the disrupted. For example, one legal case that's working its way through at the moment is involving Getty Images. So Getty Images is suing Stability AI. So Stability AI basically scraped their entire image library of their copyright protected images to train the model for Stable Diffusion, which is a generative AI image creation tool. So that's just one example. In terms of consumers, think about all of the commercial artists and photographers that are being displaced and disrupted by that exact same story of generative AI basically cutting their lunch. So there's massive risk to society with this unbridled deployment of AI across products and services. And what we're going to be talking about today is some actual stories, some recent, some not so recent, where AI has actually harmed society. And we're going to be thinking about ways that we potentially could have stopped that happening if we just stood back and asked the right questions beforehand. So we'll be talking about 4 case studies. You'll probably recognise some of the more recent ones. And we're going to be covering some different types of AI and algorithms and automated decision making. So fake news powered by Gen AI, wrongful arrest with facial recognition gone awry, machine vision being used against citizens, a welfare scandal, which was based on a very actually quite a primitive algorithm that was doing automated decision making with no human oversight. And lastly, privacy breaches, largely because of training learning models and using citizen data without their consent. So as we go through these, we're going to be using 5 lenses to really examine what was going on when the product makers decided to use AI or algorithms in their products, and what questions should they have been asking themselves to protect both their customers as well as the business. So these 5 lenses are based on various frameworks that exist, and at the end of our talk we'll share with you those AI assurance frameworks. They exist in Australia, in Singapore, in Europe. And the thing that we found that was common across all of them were these 5 different lenses, different ways of considering the potential risk and harm to society that could be caused by the product when you unleash AI on your end users. So let's just start with community benefit. And what we're really talking about here is standing back and asking this question up front: is AI the most appropriate thing to use in this context for the people that we're serving? And it's really all about observing and prioritising human rights, ethics, and the regulatory environment that we're operating in when we deploy that service. So for each of these 5 lenses that we're looking at, there's 3 questions. And these 3 questions need to be asked right at the start before you design and build your digital product or service. So in the case of community benefit, the first question is, will this be better than the existing service that they have today? Second question, will it be faster or cheaper to deliver this product or service to the end customers? And implicit in that second one is, are we passing on that benefit to the customers? And lastly, will it deliver new value to the community? So our first story relates to fake news, and fake news has been around for a long time, like before Gen AI gave its superpowers. So think back to, 2016, the US election, lots of fake news. But times that by 100 in the age of generative AI. And as people reading the news, how are you to know? How do you pick when something's fake? It's hard, right? In fact, the Singapore government recently shut down a whole bunch of fake media sites that were powered by foreign malicious agents, probably ahead of the election next year.
Yep.
So it's definitely all around us. Now, what you're not expecting is that traditional media will also be creating fake news. And in this case, let's talk about Sports Illustrated. This is a recent example from last year. And this relates specifically to their product reviewers. So here's just one of their product reviewers. So her name's Sora Tanaka. You can read her bio on the Sports Illustrated website. And she's a fitness-obsessed journalist. And the problem with this is that she's fake. The photo's fake. The bio's fake. All of her product review colleagues are fake. And the worst bit here is that those product reviews were created with Gen AI. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. Now, you're a subscriber of Sports Illustrated. You're considering spending money on an expensive piece of kit, like maybe a new bike, maybe a Garmin watch. Don't you want to know that a professional, when they wrote that product review, actually tried that product, that cutting-edge product, and compared it, the pros and cons, with other similar products? Can a Gen AI do that? A Gen AI that's probably trained on data that's at least 2 years old. So Not surprisingly, this created a massive scandal when the news came out and the customers discovered that these product reviews were fake. So the CEO got terminated. They couldn't actually terminate any of the product reviewers. The CEO lost their job. But worse than that, actually much worse than that, was the resulting brand damage to the masthead. Because if the product reviews are fake, what else is fake? Can you trust anything? So this meant that their advertisers pulled their money, customers who were paying for this content. It really begs the question, is there ever an ethical way to use Gen AI in journalism and media? Now, we believe there is. If only, right from the outset, they'd asked themselves these 3 questions before they chose to use generative AI. So first one, will it be better than the existing service? Well, I think we know it wasn't. Will it be faster or cheaper? Well, yeah, for Sports Illustrated, definitely. Did they pass on that saving to their customers? Not so much. And lastly, will it deliver any new value to the community? Now, it didn't, but how could they have mitigated these risks if they just examined and asked these questions up front? Now, they could have actually done a basic thing that is enshrined in journalism, which is fact-checking. You know, this is a basic principle of the 4th estate. This is what editors do. They could have done this and ensured that the content was actually correct. They could have declared to their customers that the content was created with generative AI. But lastly, and most importantly, they could have deployed it where it made sense, not in product reviews, because product reviews need to be based upon the cutting edge products that have just been released to market. They need to be tried by a human. There are other places in sports journalism where Gen AI makes sense. For example, an article about the rules of football. You could do a good job of that. Maybe writing a fitness program. You could do a good job of that as well. Product reviews, no. So let's move on to our second lens.
So let's talk about fairness. And what we want to get out of this is that in using AI in any of your platforms, we want to avoid bias and inequality. And we want to leverage representative data sets. And of course, using rigorous data governance. And this is kind of like more so when you're talking about maybe in governments or things that can impact the lives of civilians. So let's take a look at the questions that we want to ask ourselves. So first of all, is there potential to cause discrimination or bias in using the AI? Is your data that's being used to train the AI models incomplete or inaccurate? Because the last thing you want to do is to either exclude minorities or train the AI to discriminate against minorities. And lastly, are there poorly defined descriptors and indicators of fairness? And what we kind of want to talk about is that what is the outcome that you want from this AI model? Like, will you train it so that it eliminates bias from past historical data to ensure that there are equal opportunities and equal representation for everyone? Because as we know, like inherently, there is already bias in historical data sets, and we want to make sure we mitigate that. So let's talk about a case of wrongful arrest. So now this happened in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. And what happened is this lady over here, Portia Woodruff, she was 8 months pregnant, getting her daughters ready for school when the police showed up at her house and arrested her for robbery and carjacking. Pregnant woman, is she going to carjack? So she was actually detained for the crime that she had no knowledge about. And what happened here? So the police, they ran CCTV footage of the suspect through facial recognition search. And it actually returned a match for Miss Woodruff because she had a prior conviction arrest 6 years ago. So she is in the police database. And the victim of the carjacking was already biased towards that, because when they showed her photo in a lineup of potential criminals, he said that she was the one who carjacked him. And that was just the basis of arrest. The police didn't do any follow-up police work. And if they had done so, they would have reviewed the CCTV footage to realize that the carjacker was not pregnant. So how did it go from not pregnant to 8 months pregnant in the span of a few days? And it could not have been her. And the worst thing is that she is one of the 6 cases that has already happened in Detroit. So what should we have asked ourselves before they even decided that facial recognition was a good thing to use? Is there potential to cause discrimination or bias? Yes, there is. Because when there was investigative journalism done into this case, they found out that the database was predominantly trained on Black men. So there was already inherent bias. Is there use of incomplete or inaccurate data? Yes, because the data sets are not representative of the community, and it kind of honed in on minorities and discriminated against them. So it's not reflective of the entire population of Detroit. And are there poorly defined descriptors and indicators of fairness? We're going to say yes, because if you think about the criminal legal system, like humans, we're already inherently biased. And if, let's say, we convict more Black people than white people, the database that we have been accumulating for years already reflects that. And if we use that to train the Gen AI models, they're just going to amplify the issues that we are putting into the algorithm. So algorithms on their own, they can't fix ingrained social issues. And we really need to, as humans, combat and mitigate this. So we want to make sure we identify potential bias in systems and ensure that the data sets are diverse and representative. We need to make the conscious decision to identify that we don't want to train bias into our systems. Secondly, we want to ensure that all the decisions are always going to be fact-checked by a trained human professional. You don't want the AI to be making decisions on who is going to be arrested. And lastly, we are all inherently biased, so we should also make sure that we are aware of our own biases.
So the third lens that we're going to be talking about is accountability. And when we think about AI, accountability is really about ensuring that there's always a human in the loop, that there's always human oversight over any automated decision making, and that organisations who are deploying AI in their digital products and services are appointing people with this specific task and ensuring that their people are trained around it. So the 3 questions that form this risk scorecard around accountability. Firstly, is there sufficient training for the people who are actually using the system? Secondly, are we monitoring and auditing the output of the system, and by doing that, enabling fine-tuning and improving the system over time? And the third one is, are we establishing from the outset human governance to ensure that we're adhering to our own ethical standards as well as the regulatory environment that we're operating in? So we're going to talk about our third case study here, welfare scandal. This actually happened in Australia. So it's fairly close to home, but it's a few years ago, and it involved an algorithm that was producing automated decisions that impacted the lives of tens of thousands of Australians. And they were the most vulnerable Australians because they were welfare recipients who were dependent on welfare to support them because they couldn't get full-time work. So we called it RoboDebt. And it was an automated decision-making system. It wasn't a sophisticated AI at all. It was a pretty basic algorithm. And the way that it worked, it was deployed by a federal government agency that we call Centrelink, and they provide welfare payments to people. And what they did was they compared their historical welfare payments, sometimes going back years and years, with the annual income that was registered by the tax office for those recipients. And they used, with this algorithm, they used what they referred to as income averaging. Now, this is just an estimate of what the likely income would have been for a welfare recipient based on the annual income by the tax department. So it then issued automated debt notices to those welfare recipients that it estimated or predicted may have been overpaid. They were not concerned about underpaying, it was overpayment. And these often involved tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, it was quite extraordinary and an awful experience for a welfare recipient to be told that they owed Centrelink money from years ago, sometimes up to 10 years ago, like well past the statutory 7 years that we're required to keep tax records. So the third issue here was that public servants were firstly warned in advance that it was illegal what they were doing. And secondly, they were told to not to ignore any legal advice and warned not to challenge any of the automated decisions, those debt notices that came out of the system. So the really awful thing about all of this was the presumption of guilt on these welfare recipients, who also had no means of challenging it. Because if you're a casual worker, do you keep your paychecks from week to week and keep them for years and years? It was almost impossible to prove their innocence. And what this resulted in was, in Australia, we call it a royal commission. It's when it goes to the very highest court. And it was determined to be illegal. The Liberal government at the time, they're no longer in power, but a lot of public servants lost their jobs. It was a national scandal. It was shameful. And the government had to pay back $1.8 billion in those debt notices. They had to pay them back to the recipients in full. So, yeah, national scandal. Could it have been prevented? Well, let's just talk about accountability and ensuring a human is in the loop and ask ourselves, sadly in hindsight, that these should have been the questions that were asked by Centrelink right at the start before they deployed this really faulty algorithm. Firstly, are we going to train the people using the system so that they understand how these decisions are made? And we know in hindsight they didn't. Secondly, will the performance of the system and those decisions that are being made by that algorithm, will it be monitored? Now, once again, we know they weren't able to do this because it was income averaging. There was no real data to prove that these automated decisions were based on fact. And the last one, human governance and oversight. Well, where was it? Where were the humans that were in place from the beginning to review the appeals and the feedback that they were getting from their customer-facing staff? In terms of mitigation, it was such a horrible program, and the best legal advice said they should never use it. But let's be positive. So they could have trained their staff. They could have trained their customer-facing staff so they understood how these debt notices were being issued. They could have actually audited the performance and tried to improve it over time, tried to improve the algorithm. And lastly, human governance. Well, they should really have established a governance board from the outset to review the appeals and to respond to them. They did none of these things. Now, because this is such a doozy of a case study, we're going to apply our fourth lens to the same story. And this one is about transparency. And when we're talking about AI, what we really mean with transparency is being able to open that black box, to understand where that data is coming from and to make that explainable to people and giving complete visibility to the people impacted. So the 3 questions on our risk scorecard when it comes to transparency. Firstly, can we explain those automated decisions? Secondly, are users informed that they're, in this case, dealing with an algorithm? That those debt notices that they were getting were from a machine, not from Centrelink staff. And the third question we need to be asking ourselves up front from the outset, is there a clear process that we're putting in place for appeal? So against these 3 questions, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that for Centrelink, these automated debt notices were not backed up by real data. There was no way that could be explained. Secondly, are users informed that they're dealing with an algorithm? No, they weren't. They just got this debt notice from Centrelink. They assumed that someone who knew better than them had done the maths. And lastly, a clear process for appeal or redress. Well, it was almost impossible for the victims of robo-debt to appeal because it was almost impossible for them to have the paperwork from years back from their weekly paychecks. So was there any mitigation that they could have used? Is there any way they could have legally used AI or algorithms to detect welfare fraud? Well, there probably is. Like, maybe not using this income averaging, but they could have used recent data. You know, they could have addressed active welfare fraud as it's happening rather than going after suspected welfare fraud that occurred years ago. If they just turned the problem on its head and thought about what is the best context for use and how could we actually use AI to correctly detect welfare fraud. But let's move on to our last lens.
Yes, so we're at lens number 5, privacy. So I'm pretty sure everyone in the room here is all about privacy. And we want to ensure that there is secure, transparent, and compliant data use so that we're going to trust these systems that we interact with. So let's talk about the questions. So in terms of user data, are the individuals that you're harnessing the data from, can they be identified based on various aspects like religion, gender, or ethnicity? Have these individuals given their consent for their data to be used in whatever format that you want? And is your system compliant with privacy laws across various countries that you might operate in? So let's look at what potentially could be a privacy breach. And it's going to be a platform that everyone here probably is on. We're going to talk about LinkedIn. So as everyone knows, recently, LinkedIn just revealed that, hey, we are actually training our Gen AI model on your data. Personal data, whatever you've been posting on LinkedIn, everything, it's just scraping it. But what it kind of like didn't really say is that it actually have been training their Gen AI model on our data for years, way before they've like publicly come out and said that, hey, we're doing this. So now that they've recently like updated their privacy policy, they're kind of like backpedaling a little bit, but this doesn't stop the fact that so many users in many different countries have been affected, maybe except the EU because they are really like strong arming their privacy laws. And the problem is that once you have actually trained like the data, opting out is not going to make the training data go away. It's just going to stay there. And the worst thing about this is that LinkedIn is also saying, we might share our data with other third parties like our parent, Microsoft. So we're not being involved with like, are we going to share our data as well? Like we didn't say that we want to. And because of this scandal, LinkedIn actually has been like basically given a cease and desist in the UK. Like UK say you have to stop training your data on like our citizens because we're going to like put a stop to this. But like I said, trying to remove previously like data that's used to train, like it's almost impossible in your LLMs. So what happened here? Like what should we be asking ourselves in order to circumvent this? So can individuals be identified based on the user data that's being scraped? So we do not know for sure if LinkedIn like is actually taking certain steps to actually protect us. It's a black box. They've never said like yes or no. Have we given our consent? Definitely not. Like I found out about this because people started posting on their feed, and I'm like, oh, I need to go and opt out from this thing. And is the system compliant with privacy law? So the issue is that the EU is not the only governing body that has privacy laws in place. Like Singapore has that too. So we have what's called PDPA, and it actually clearly states that organizations are required to provide information about what personal data is collected and why, and to seek our consent. And LinkedIn was in clear violation of that when Singaporeans were opted in by default. So what could have been done to mitigate this? Well, obviously, don't opt people in by default, like gain consent by asking us if you want to opt in. Clearly state your intent of collecting and using customer data before you start collecting and using customer data. And lastly, we need to make sure that the companies actually comply with privacy data protection laws, which is a given, right? You would assume. So let's kind of wrap up. It's getting late. So in summary, we want to always like ensure that there is human judgment in all of this, and it's critical to the success of AI to achieve whatever goals we want AI to achieve for us. And don't put blind trust in your algorithms and decisions made by machines, because the models are only as good as the data it's being trained on. So just to recap, all the 5 lenses that we walked through and the case studies that we've like referenced to talk about all of this. So community benefit is talking about the benefit to people who use the products or are directly impacted by the products. Fairness, we looked at how we can ensure that machine-made decisions are going to be free from bias and appropriate to users of the products and in the context. Accountability, we want to make sure that there is a human in the loop and humans are ultimately responsible for the critical decisions that are made. Transparency is about opening this black box into the algorithms and the AI to ensure that all these machine-made decisions are going to be explainable. And privacy, are we taking steps to protect the privacy of the people who are providing the data that you're using? And they're going to comply with the regulations across different governments. So like we said, we're going to share with you the various frameworks that we have referenced to come up with our 5 lenses. And if your organization already doesn't have certain AI governances in place, you might want to take a look at what exists out there in the world, as we also have done in our talk.